What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you with another solo video today. I am continuing the series I started last Monday talking about what makes an elite running back a league-winning option in 2021 fantasy football and how do you spot them. We're doing the same thing with wide receivers. What this basically is an early round wide receiver strategy video. Who has the ceiling, who doesn't, who has too much risk. This exercise is also going to outline boomer bust options, as well as guys that might have low ceilings and kind of differentiate between the two. We hear the term ceiling thrown around all the time, right? Every time somebody talks about an exciting young player, it's like, well, this guy has a tremendous ceiling. Who actually has this ceiling is what we're going to investigate. And the most important thing that you guys can garner from this video is that you need to weight all factors. As I mentioned with running backs, you can't just focus on talent. You have to also focus on what kind of volume that they're going to be getting. And you also have to focus on the situation and their efficiency. So again, don't just focus on talent. Don't just focus on volume. All things need to be factored in. The more boxes a player can check, the higher their ceiling, the higher their floor, and the higher the chances that they can win you a fantasy championship. And if you guys haven't already done so, we are on the road to 5,000 subscribers. We're hoping to get there by August 1st. So if you haven't already done so, please go down to the bottom of the screen, hit the subscribe button. It's totally free to do so. And while you're down there, leave a comment and like the video as well. We are going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into this. Okay, so just like we did for running backs, who are we talking about, right? What are we got to define these league-winning wide receivers. What does it take to make those true difference-making wide receiver ones? And to me, a difference-making wide receiver one was a guy that averaged 20-plus PPR points per game with a minimum of 12 games played. So I went back from 2020 to 2013, and we're going to go over the volume-based factors first, but these were the guys that were those difference-making options, right? You can see Davante Adams, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs this past year, Michael Thomas in 2019, so on and so forth, all the way back to Josh Gordon in 2013, Calvin Johnson in 2013. And if you guys missed the running back video and you're curious what these colors are, is that among these 23 wide receivers that I have here, anything in green indicates that they were above average among the other elite options, these 23 wide receivers. Yellow is anything, around average. Red would be considered below average. But remember, we're using a sample of elite fantasy options. So anybody who has a below average mark, it's only below average amongst these 23 receivers, not below average compared to the rest of the receivers in the NFL, because they'd all be above average in everything. If that was the case. So this past year, we saw the true difference makers at wide receiver. We know that running backs get all the shine, right? They're the guys that we're drafting early, and they're the guys that are most likely going to be league winners. But Stephon Diggs was actually the highest owned player on championship rosters this past season. And Tyreek Hill and Davante Adams were both top 8 in championship roster ownership percentage as well. So over the years, we've seen some truly special wide receiver seasons. We've seen Antonio Brown pretty much any year be a dominant wide receiver. Josh Gordon had a great year in 2013. OBJ, his rookie year, and the year after that. Julio Jones has had his share of elite seasons. DeAndre Hopkins and Tyreek Hill and all these guys. Davante Adams the last couple of years. We've seen these guys produce really special difference-making type seasons. And when you're passing on the potential in these early round picks of those potential workhorse running backs, like, we talked about Antonio Gibson and Cam Akers and all these guys, if you're going to pass on those guys, you want to know that at minimum, you're getting one of these dudes, these elite difference-making wide receivers, as a consolation prize for passing on those running backs early. And to make it easier to understand, here are the averages of what those 23 wide receivers averaged based upon all those volume-based factors. And you can see 10.9 targets per game was the average amongst these wide receivers, 7.13 receptions per game, and 0.78 touchdowns. Make it easier to understand the paced average over a 16-game season. And I know we have 17 games now, but just for simplicity's sake, we'll go to a 16-game season. Almost 175 targets, 114 receptions, and 12 and a half touchdowns. So those averages that I referenced, those guys that were either above average, average, or below average among those 23 receivers, these were the averages that I'm referring to. And that makes it a little easier to understand if the first part was too confusing. But on average, to be one of those elite 20-plus PPR points per game wide receivers, you needed this amount of volume. That's the volume factors that we're going to be talking about. Now let's move on to some of the situational factors. And I tweeted this out earlier today. So if you're not following me on Twitter, please go ahead and do so. But the reason I talk about volume only being a part of being an elite wide receiver is for this reason. If you could see on the screen right now, among the top 10 wide receivers, only 3 of them actually finish as top 10 wide receivers in points per game. When we're looking at guys that had high targets per game, it didn't always equate to elite fantasy production. It's a big part of elite fantasy production, but it's not the only thing. And that's what we're going to be getting into with these situational factors. We love volume in fantasy, but it isn't everything. We've seen Jarvis Landry in 2017, Larry Fitzgerald in 2017, receive 160 plus targets and still only be back end wide receiver ones because those situational factors weren't present for those guys. They didn't have the offense. They didn't have the talent. They didn't have the situation around them to be conducive to an elite fantasy wide receiver season. And speaking of, here's the offensive situational factors around these guys. And you can see them on the screen right now. The first few, much like they were for running backs, are very team specific, right? We have offensive rank and points per game. So how good is your offense? How good was your quarterback? And I measured it by quarterback rating. I could have just subjectively looked at who their quarterback was that year and been yes or no, your quarterback was good. But I figured to measure it in QBR, I gave it a quantitative value. So I did that. And then after that, we looked at how many times did the team throw the ball? So their amount of pass attempts that they had. And how good was your offensive line and pass protection? I just used PFF to measure that because for offensive line, I find them to be pretty accurate. Maybe you disagree, but in terms of pass protection, I wanted to know if that was important as well. So I chose to measure that. And the other two that I didn't mention that I want to draw your attention to that most people probably won't talk about when they're looking at wide receivers and how to evaluate them is the highest targeted secondary option in the offense and their yards per route run. And I fiddled around with a lot of different things before I settled on these two as the other two factors I wanted to measure. But when you think about the highest targeted secondary option in the offense, what I'm talking about is how good was their target competition, right? Because some of these receivers, and you can see it on the screen, Devontae Adams' secondary option only had 63 targets. And I believe it was Robert Tonyan or Alan Lazard last year that had those amount of targets. Like that type of competition for targets should yield very high numbers for Devontae Adams, right? Because he doesn't have to compete with another elite pass catching option. Whereas you can see with Tyreek Hill this year, Travis Kelce actually out-targeted Tyreek Hill. So he actually was the secondary option and was still able to finish as an elite option. So that was important to me. And I wanted to measure that due to the amount of great receiving duos we have around the NFL, right? I'm going to get into the receivers that we're going to look at this year, but we have the Buccaneers receivers with Evans and Godwin. We have the Cowboys with CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper. We have the Bengals with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. We have the Rams with Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, and there's plenty more out there. So you can see with Tyreek having Kelce this year, Antonio Brown had Juju in 2018, who also out-targeted him. We had Demaryius Thomas in 2014 having Emmanuel Sanders to compete with. Brandon Marshall had Eric Decker to compete with in 2015. Jordy Nelson having Randall Cobb to compete with in 2014. We can see that generally speaking, it's okay to have another great option in your offense, but you're going to need to make up that target differential in other places because you can imagine they probably didn't command the targets that they would have commanded if they were in an offense all on their own with no other great options on the team. So like I said, it's better if you have that clear number one role that Devontae Adams had this past year. We've seen from Julio and DeAndre Hopkins and Antonio Brown in their primes, but it is okay to have another good option in your offense. You can still get this elite wide receiver output with a good wide receiver in your offense. We've seen it on numerous occasions so far, like I just mentioned. So in yards per route run, and the reason I chose this as something that I wanted to measure is similar to what I said with quarterback rating. I could have objectively gone, is this a talented wide receiver, right? I could have been like, was this guy a talented wide receiver? Do I really believe he's one of the, 5-10 best receivers in the league? Or am I just going to say, oh, he just got there because of volume? And yards per route run is the way I chose to measure this because it has been the most predictive stat relating to a wide receiver's raw talent. And there's absolutely, and you can see it on the screen, there's absolutely a correlation between the elite options, the elite fantasy wide receivers, and their finish in yards per route run. Because obviously to be an elite fantasy wide receiver, you need to be great in real life. You need to get open. You need to catch the ball. You need to create yards after the catch. And all of those factor into what your yards per route run would actually end up being. So I chose to use that to measure talent. And just like with running backs, it always helps you sleep at night knowing that your wide receiver that you chose early in your drafts, let's say you take a wide receiver in the second round, they're attached to a good situation, a good offense, a good play caller, a good offensive line, and a good quarterback. And again, the more boxes a player can check, the easier it is for him to reach that elite level and the less efficient he'll need to be on his own, the less he'll have to overcome with his talent. Because we've seen guys this past year like A.J. Brown and Justin Jefferson overcome low volume by being such great players, but you want to be able to mitigate that as much risk as you can by attacking people that have target volume and are in good situations. And you can see that if a player was deficient in one area, like Tyreek Hill this past year, he only received 9 targets a game and he needed to score touchdowns. He needed to have Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback. He needed to be in a pass heavy offense and he needed to be top 12 in yards per route run to make up for the fact that he was only getting 9 targets a game. You can't have a guy who gets 9 targets a game and also in a bad situation unless that guy is just a super phenomenal player, reach that elite level ceiling. And the opposite is also true, right? In 2017, DeAndre Hopkins had Deshaun Watson go down and he was dealing with Tom Savage like half the year. And he needed 11.6 targets per game to be that elite option. Had he not gotten that volume, he wouldn't have been that high-end option that he was that year. He needed elite option to overcome his bad offense, his bad quarterback play, the fact that they weren't scoring very many points. And he also was by far and away the clear number one target in that offense because Will Fuller got hurt that year. So it goes both ways. They kind of play into each other, volume and situation. They all depend on each other. And the simple thing that we can gather from this, like I just said, is that these things are related. A player can have talent, but if he is not going to get the volume, if he's in a terrible offense, we can't expect a huge ceiling out of that player. It's just common sense. And all three of these things are related: talent, situation, and volume. But most people will just look at the target potential of a player and they think that targets equal fantasy points. And it's only part of the equation. It's not a total one-to-one comparison. And you can see right now on the screen, you'll see the averages of the situational factors that I talked about. So on average, those 23 elite options over the past, 8 years or whatever, on average, they had a top 10 offense. On average, they had a top 10 quarterback. On average, they were throwing the ball 600 times a game. On average, they had their highest targeted secondary option was only getting about 100 targets a year. Offensive line was a top 8 unit on average, and their yards per route run was top 5 in the NFL. So they were a top 5 real life receiver that year, basically in yards per route run. And again, there's very few players that are going to check every box. If you go back and look at that table, there's nobody on there that checks every single box except for one player. And if you want to hear something absolutely absurd, the only player that checked every box that I just mentioned, those averages and the volume, was Antonio Brown. And not only did Antonio Brown do it once, he did it 4 straight years as the only elite of the elite to check every single box from 2014 to 2017. No other player did it one time. Did they check every single box? And AB did it 4 consecutive seasons. So if you ask me, first ballot Hall of Famer in my book. He's a potential scumbag human being, but as a football player, man, holy shit. Now that we have this information, now that we've gone back and looked at the previous years, we can apply it to the current crop of top wide receivers in fantasy and see which players realistically have that makeup that we're looking for. I went through the top 32 wide receivers in Underdog ADP. Due to the nature of the position, I only went over the top 20 running backs, but I went over the top 32 wide receivers. And again, due to the nature of the position, it's a deeper crop of elite talent. It's not as scarce as the running back position is, which makes sense. There's a lot of great wide receivers in the NFL. Some teams have multiple great wide receivers. Not a lot of teams have multiple great running backs for fantasy. And unlike what I did for running backs, I'm going to go through these 8 wide receivers at a time just because it'll be too confusing if I just threw 32 wide receivers on the screen at once. So we're going to start with the top 8 wide receivers according to Underdog ADP. And at the top of the wide receiver ADP, we can see that the most boxes are checked as expected, right? These guys are going top 8 in ADP for a reason. We've generally been very accurate at guessing which wide receivers are going to be best in fantasy year over year, actually more so than every other position. Because the further we get down in these ADPs, the more question marks and the more red spots that we're going to see. But these are the top 8 guys. And I'm going to go through them one by one, just explaining my rationale on the color I gave them, the yes, no question mark that I gave them, just really quick, just so that there's total transparency for how I conducted this exercise. Right. So we're going to start with Tyreek Hill. And the volume has never been there, right? Targets and receptions, I put no because he's never achieved it in his career. Why would he achieve it now? Touchdowns, he plays with Patrick Mahomes. There's always that elite touchdown upside, and we've seen it from Tyreek Hill. And then when we look at the situational factors, again, obviously, this is going to be very good for him because he plays with an Andy Reid offense. We know his quarterback play, his scoring, and his yards per route run, because he's an elite talent at the wide receiver, are always going to be there. The only question I have about Tyreek Hill, and it's not a question, I know for a certainty that Travis Kelce will out-target Tyreek Hill this year. It's happened every year of Tyreek Hill's career. We can't expect anything different going forward. And another question mark I have is how good is the offensive line going to be, because they rebuilt it on the fly with Joe Thuney and Orlando Brown. But I imagine that's probably going to be at least a top 15 offensive line, if not a top 10 offensive line, given the additions that they made. So Stephon Diggs, real quick, we'll go over him. The only question mark I had about him was touchdowns, because he's never had double-digit touchdowns in his career. He could definitely have them, which is why it's a question mark and not a no, because he's in an elite offense with an elite quarterback. So he checks every box except for the touchdown department, basically. And when we go to Devontae Adams at wide receiver 3, I'm just going to preface this with, I'm assuming Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback. If Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback, I will have to reevaluate and redo this for Devontae Adams. I would imagine the targets, receptions, and touchdowns probably would go down, obviously, but not a lot. I would still probably have them all as yellow yeses instead of green yeses. And then offensive rank and points per game would probably become a question mark. Quarterback ranks and quarterback rating also be a question mark. And then team pass attempts would probably be the same. Highest targeted secondary option, also probably the same. Offensive line rank doesn't change, and rank in yards per route run doesn't change. So anything situational would probably change with Devontae Adams if Aaron Rodgers is gone, but I'm just going to assume he's going to be on the team for now, just for simplicity's sake. And then DeAndre Hopkins, again, he checks most boxes, especially the volume-related ones. The only question marks I have about him are how good is Kyler Murray as a passer, not as a runner, as a passer, and offensive line. It wasn't very good last year. They didn't really make too many upgrades to it. So those are the two question marks I have about him. Calvin Ridley, offensive rank and points per game. How good is the Falcons offense going to be without Julio Jones? The team pass attempts could go down with Arthur Smith coming in. He might implement a more run-heavy approach. And their offensive line wasn't very good last year, and I don't expect it to be very good this year. So that's another question mark with him. A.J. Brown, targets and receptions. With Julio Jones coming in, I don't think he's going to see elite volume. And then the offensive line wasn't very good last year, but it could get better. Taylor Lewan was out for most of the year, and they started God knows who at right tackle because Isaiah Wilson was just a colossal bust. And highest targeted secondary option, I expect Julio Jones to match him in targets, if not out-target him, his first year in Tennessee. So that one I can't give him a yes for either. DK Metcalf, targets and receptions, he's not going to get there. They don't throw the ball enough. And then team pass attempts, like I said, they don't throw the ball enough. Offensive line's not very good. Highest targeted secondary option, Tyler Lockett will probably out-target, if not match DK Metcalf in targets this year, just by the nature of their roles that they play. And then Justin Jefferson, finally, to close out the top 8 of the wide receivers. I have no idea what his target and reception volume is going to be. He only had 125 targets last year, but he could absolutely see an increase this season because he's, came off one of the most efficient rookie seasons we've ever seen. It would only make sense to give him more volume because he's earned it. And then when you go to the situational factors with Justin Jefferson, team pass attempts probably not going to be there for the Minnesota Vikings. And then offensive line rank and pass blocking also hasn't been a very good offensive line from a pass protection standpoint. They're pretty good in run blocking, but pass protection hasn't been their strongest suit. So we're going to go to the next set of 8 wide receivers. We have Michael Thomas, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, Allen Robinson, Terry McLaurin, CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, and Julio Jones. These are wide receivers 9 through 16 in Underdog ADP. And you can see that there's a little bit of a drop off the boxes that these guys check, which is to be expected because we're going down the ranks in ADP. Each guy should be less and less based on our ability to evaluate these dudes. And as you can see with Michael Thomas, the elite volume should be there, right? We've seen elite reception, elite target volume before. Touchdowns, not so much. And we have question marks about the quarterback play there. But I think if Jameis Winston plays, it really doesn't, it's not too much of an issue for me. And the pass attempts are never going to be very high because that's just not how the New Orleans Saints roll anymore. Keenan Allen, again, probably a guy in this range that has one of the fewest amount of question marks that you can see. The only question mark we have with him is how many touchdowns is he going to score, because he's never been a very high touchdown scoring receiver. But he could score more touchdowns than I'm giving him credit for, because if Justin Herbert takes a huge step forward. From an offensive situation perspective, like I said, it doesn't get any better than Keenan Allen's situation. The only question mark he has is how good is his offensive line? And they added so much to that offensive line that I actually do think it's going to be a very improved unit. Amari Cooper, same thing kind of as Keenan Allen. He's got a great quarterback throwing him the ball. They're going to throw the ball like crazy. He's going to have a chance to get up in that 150, 160 target range if he can stay healthy the whole season and Dak can stay healthy the whole season. His highest targeted secondary option is the only red thing that I have there, because I expect CeeDee Lamb to exceed 105 targets pretty comfortably. And his offensive line rank and pass blocking is only listed as a question mark because they've had so much trouble staying healthy as an offensive line unit. So I can't just, lock them in. They're all going to stay healthy 16 games because Tyron Smith and Zach Martin are now getting up there in age to the point that maybe they won't stay healthy the whole season. So Allen Robinson, I'll try and speed these up a little bit. He doesn't have the touchdown upside offensive rank and points per game, and the quarterback play is a question mark. We don't know if it's Andy Dalton. We don't know if it's Justin Fields. I'd imagine, regardless, they're not going to be a top 10 offense. They're not going to be a top 10 quarterback play from a rookie quarterback. So I just decided to leave that as no. And then their offensive line, I just totally don't trust what they did with that, releasing their left tackle, replacing him with a rookie left tackle and Tevin Jenkins, who played right tackle in college. Not the biggest fan of that move. And then Terry McLaurin, a guy that I really like, and the reason you can see why. The high targets, the high receptions, upside is absolutely there. The team pass attempts should be there. They threw the ball at a very high clip last year. Highest targeted secondary option. Curtis Samuel will eat into Terry McLaurin's targets, but 100 targets for Curtis Samuel sounds about right to me. I don't think he's going to exceed that number. Offensive line rank and pass blocking. They were actually a top 5 offensive line in pass protection last year, and they actually added to that group. So I wouldn't expect that to drop off too much. And then yards per route run, he's also a very talented player in his own right. CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, and Julio Jones will just close out with those guys. I don't see any of them getting the target potential that they could get, but all of them could get the touchdown potential. And I think Mike Evans for sure has the touchdown potential. And they're all in good situations. They're all in top, 5 to 7 offenses that are going to throw the ball a lot. The only problem is that all 3 of these guys have a major target that they're going to be competing with. With Lamb, it's Amari Cooper. With Evans, it's Godwin and Antonio Brown. And Julio Jones has AJ Brown to compete with. So they all have pretty similar concerns. And like I said, you can see as we go along with these, there's going to be a drop off in how many question marks each guy has versus the next. So to the next group that we have here, wide receivers 17 through 24. And here is where I noticed the biggest difference between one group to the next, especially from a volume perspective. There was nobody in this group that I reasonably project 150 plus targets, even at their ceiling. Cooper Kupp and Deontay Johnson, in my opinion, of this group is the closest I could project. Maybe Jamar Chase, if you wanted to get a little hot takey, but Deontay Johnson had 144 targets last season, and that required a league high 656 pass attempts from the Steelers offense as a whole. And I don't expect that to stay at that level because they committed to the run by drafting a running back in the first round, changing offensive coordinators to more of a run heavy approach. I don't expect them to throw the ball 656 times, and I don't think Deontay Johnson is going to significantly out-target Juju Smith-Schuster or Chase Claypool. I think they're all going to be pretty close in targets, and Johnson, to me, needed that kind of volume, and he still kind of underperformed for having 144 targets last year. And then Cooper Kupp, I just don't think he can get to that volume either because of his competition with Robert Woods. When you go through each of these guys one by one, you can see DJ Moore has a lot of question marks, man. I love the talent of DJ Moore, and you can see that with the yards per route run. That's the only box he checked for me because I have question marks about the quarterback. I have question marks about how good the offense is going to be in general. We know that Robbie Anderson was heavily involved last year. They also drafted Terrace Marshall. Team pass attempts weren't that high last year. His offensive line wasn't good. He's not a guy that scores a lot of touchdowns. I have a lot more questions about DJ Moore after doing this exercise than I did prior to doing it. And when we move on to the next couple guys, we have Robert Woods and Chris Godwin. To me, they're both lower ceiling options just because they have to compete with some great targets in their own offenses. But their offenses should be good enough to support multiple options, which is why you see a lot of green in the situational perspective. But the highest targeted secondary option, they're going to exceed 105 targets pretty comfortably in both situations. Jamar Chase has a lot of question marks, and understandably so. He's a rookie receiver. I don't know how good he actually is. I believe he's a good player, which is why I gave him a yes for ranking yards per route run. His highest targeted secondary option, I believe T. Higgins is probably going to have more than 105 targets this year. Offensive line isn't going to be very good. Quarterback play should be good. Team pass attempts definitely should be up there. They're going to throw the ball quite a bit, but we don't know what his volume is going to be. We don't know how efficient the offense is going to be either. So Jamar Chase, to me, has some question marks, but he actually is one of the better options in this group of 8 wide receivers. Cooper Kupp, as I mentioned, for Robert Woods, the situation's great. The only difference between the two guys is that Cooper Kupp actually has a lot more touchdown upside than Robert Woods. So in my rankings, I actually have Kupp over Woods. I know in ADP, they're actually going in the opposite order, but I would take Kupp over Woods if I was, given the choice overall. Tyler Lockett, a lot of questions with him, in my opinion. I don't think he has the target potential, the reception potential. The offense isn't going to throw the ball very much. He has DK Metcalf to compete with targets. Offensive line isn't very good. The only thing that you can say about Tyler Lockett is that he can score touchdowns, and he's got a great quarterback, and he should be in a good offense next year. So, I mean, he's going to be a guy that's going to be fantasy relevant, obviously. I just don't know how big of a ceiling he has. Adam Thielen is completely capped by Justin Jefferson, in my opinion. Targets, receptions, not there. Touchdowns could be there. Offense should be solid. Quarterback play should be solid, but team pass attempts, Offensive line, those are the question marks I have with him. And then Deontay Johnson, as I mentioned, all I really see with Deontay Johnson is a great route runner. We haven't even seen a guy that is a great receiver all around because he's struggled with drops. He's struggled with consistency and some of those things. He's a great route runner, and the team pass attempts should be around 600, but I don't expect them to be 656 like they were last year. So that's where my question marks lie with him. We'll go to the final group of wide receivers, the final 8 wide receivers, and then I'll talk about these guys, on the surface level. And we can see T. Higgins, Kenny Golladay, Brandon Ayuk, Odell Beckham, Cortland Sutton, Chase Claypool, DJ Chark, and Robbie Anderson going off the board, wide receiver 25 to 32. We can see that there's the most red on this one. Obviously, these guys probably aren't any of them going to reach that 150 plus target range, 160 target range. The only one I could see potentially doing it on here is Kenny Golladay. And you can see I have a lot of question marks beside Kenny Golladay, which might make him a good investment because the ceiling is absolutely there from a touchdown perspective. The ceiling is there from the fact that he has target competition, but nobody that's going to command 150 targets or 130 targets even. I think the highest targeted secondary option in the Giants offense will either be Saquon Barkley or it'll be Sterling Shepard or Evan Ingram. And I can't see any of those options getting well over 100 targets. They might get 100-ish targets, but that's probably about it. And then we know Kenny Golladay is also a great wide receiver. T. Higgins, same thing I said for Jamar Chase, only we know for a fact he doesn't have an elite target ceiling, but the offense should be solid. They should be throwing the ball a lot, and he's a very talented player. Brandon Ayuk, again, a lot more of a efficiency over volume projection for Brandon Ayuk. He's not going to have elite target volume because of George Kittle, because of Deebo Samuel, and because the Niners aren't going to throw the ball at a crazy clip. But the offense should be good. He's a very talented player. Offensive line's very good. And the quarterback situation should work itself out to the point that he's going to have about an average quarterback situation at worst and potentially a great quarterback situation if Trey Lance can come in right away and be a phenomenal quarterback. So Ayuk is a guy that you're going to see in a second. I really like as well at his value. Odell Beckham just has a very low ceiling, in my opinion. He has a good situation around him, but his target potential is not there because of how run heavy the Browns are. And the fact that Odell Beckham isn't the same player that he used to be. He's not nearly as talented as he was 5 years ago. So I don't think he has that elite ceiling simply by the fact that his team doesn't throw the ball enough and he's not a good enough player to achieve that elite ceiling. And then Cortland Sutton, this was one of the more surprising things that I found of this entire exercise. We're overrating Cortland Sutton, man. The only box that I checked for Cortland Sutton is that he's a talented player, really. The question mark I have is how good is his offensive line? It wasn't good last year, but they have Mike Munchak, and the offense of line should be a lot better than it was last year, but his targets aren't going to be there. His receptions aren't going to be there. His touchdowns aren't going to be there. Offense isn't going to be very good. The quarterback play isn't going to be very good. The team pass attempts isn't going to be very good. And he's going to have to compete with Jerry Jeudy and Noah Fant. So Cortland Sutton is a guy that I might have to cool down on a little bit based on this information because he was a guy I really liked at first. And now that I think about it, it's like, how is Drew Lock going to support 3 options that we're all really excited about? Somebody's going to disappoint. And I have a feeling it's going to be Cortland Sutton of the guys that we're talking about. So I'll just take Jerry Jeudy. He's going later in ADP, and I actually believe more in him as a player than I did in Sutton coming out of school. And I think Jeudy is still a very talented player in his own right. So I'll just take Jeudy at value and kind of avoid Cortland Sutton for the time being. And then we get to Chase Claypool. Again, talent is always there. How good is the offense? How good is Ben Roethlisberger going to be? And how many times are they going to throw the ball? Because we know Chase Claypool is going to be efficient on his targets. Same goes for DJ Chark. I think he's a guy that's very underrated right now because everybody's focused on Laviska Shenault. Everybody's focused on the fact that he's tearing it up in camp. DJ Chark was a guy that was a deep threat, right? He was a deep threat last year, but think about who was throwing the ball to him, right? The reason he was so inconsistent was because he had Gardner Minshew and Jake Luton throwing him the ball. If Trevor Lawrence comes into the league and plays like Justin Herbert did last year, then DJ Chark's going to be a very good option. He's going to be an A+ version of what we got out of Mike Williams and Jalen Guyton combined last year with Justin Herbert. I think DJ Chark is a guy that can return a lot more value than people think. Obviously, he doesn't have the elite 160 target receiving ceiling that is the whole purpose of this exercise, but I still think he's going to be a good option next year and is going undervalued. And then finally, at wide receiver 32, we have Robbie Anderson. Again, much like DJ Moore, the situation is kind of lackluster. Even if we get an improved Sam Darnold, how much can we really expect these guys to return a huge ceiling? Because they do have to compete with each other. They have to compete with Terrace Marshall. And of course, they have to compete with Christian McCaffrey, who's going to have 120 targets probably himself. So these Carolina receivers are good options, but I think there are more so low ceiling options. And I would say this entire last tier, these last 8 wide receivers are all low ceiling options, except for maybe Kenny Golladay, Brandon Ayuk, and Chase Claypool. I think everybody on this list here is a lower ceiling option than some of the guys that we talked about previously. So now you can see a culmination of the entire thing, right? Here's all 32 wide receivers on the screen at once. And much like I did with the running backs, I gave them a yellow, a green, orange, or a red. And if you missed the running back video, here's how I quantified them. Anything that they ranked green in, meaning above average, was worth 8 points. Anything that they ranked yellow in was 5 points. Orange was -2 points, and red was -5 points. So if a player had a lot of great factors, it would outweigh the negative factors that they have. And I think that's a good philosophy to have in general. When you could say a player is super talented, he's super good, the offense and the quarterback is super good around him, he's likely going to outperform things if his volume maybe isn't there. That's just my philosophy in fantasy. And again, this whole exercise is a measure of a player's ability to check boxes. It's completely relative to my opinion because I'm the one who evaluated this, but I think I did a good job of explaining my rationale in the last, 10 minutes or so that I've been talking. So if you disagree with anything, feel free to leave a comment down below what you disagree with, and I'd be happy to explain my rationale further down there or have a spirited debate in the comment section. So who are the dudes this year that can be league winning wide receivers? Guys that average 20 plus PPR points per game. You can see them on the screen right now in green. The guys that I'm going to stake my claim right now can achieve that level of ceiling, and the risk is worth the reward because the yellow guys could also potentially achieve it, but the risk is probably a little bit too much so that it indicates that it's not really likely. The guys that I see this with, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, those should be obvious, right? They're guys that have done it already, but outside of those top 5 dudes, Michael Thomas, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, and Terry McLaurin. Those are the guys that I think can jump from, they're going in the 3rd, 4th round of drafts right now. They can jump from 3rd or 4th round players to 2nd round or 1st round players this time next year because they can achieve that elite level ceiling. They have everything going for them. Michael Thomas, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, and Terry McLaurin. They all have good situations. They have good quarterbacks. They have good target potential. Terry McLaurin and Amari Cooper have a little bit more competition for targets than Michael Thomas and Keenan Allen have. But in both Terry McLaurin and Amari Cooper situations, the offense should be good enough. They should be throwing the ball enough. And they're both good enough players, obviously, too, to account for the fact that they're going to have to compete for targets. And I think they all 4 of those dudes have the elite ceiling that we're looking for outside of the top guys. And yellow, anybody in yellow right now on the screen, you can see Tyreek Hill, Calvin Ridley, AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Chris Godwin, and Cooper Kupp. All of these guys are good options, and the ceiling is maybe not there. It's a bit lower than some of the other guys, or they're a little bit riskier. Like Tyreek Hill, the ceiling is there, but he's a little riskier than Stephon Diggs, DeAndre Hopkins, and Devontae Adams because of the target volume. And then the orange is one of 2 things, right? When we're looking at the orange column, we're either looking at a ceiling versus risk situation where this could be a boom or bust option. And you can see DK Metcalf listed as an orange, Julio Jones, Jamar Chase, and Kenny Golladay. These guys are boom or bust options. Or we could see a situation where this guy is a solid option. He just doesn't have a high ceiling. And that's where Robert Woods, why he is an orange one as well, because Robert Woods' ceiling is probably a wide receiver 10. But his floor is probably wide receiver 22 or something like that. He's a very low range of outcomes, but he doesn't have an elite ceiling, which is why I have him as an orange and not as a yellow. And then finally, a guy that has red over his name is where the risk outweighs the reward, where he has a high risk to a medium ceiling, for example, or it's a player that has a very low ceiling, like Odell Beckham, for example. And like I said, the further we get down in ADP, it's very hard to expect that these guys are going to have super high ceilings because we usually only see 1 or 2 guys per season that come out of the 6th round or later and establish themselves as great options. And again, we're talking about elite wide receivers, not great wide receivers. So it's going to be very tough for anybody outside of the top, 20 wide receivers to achieve that elite level ceiling because it would be just a huge whiff by the entire fantasy community if we missed a guy like that with that elite level potential. And it happened last year with Stephon Diggs, so it is possible. Okay, and unlike I did in the running back video, I waited till the end to go through each of these guys, but like I just told you guys, going through each player one by one, I kind of already did that, so I'm not going to go through them at face value at the end here, but you could see the guys that I have targeted, and it makes sense why I have them targeted that way. And if you guys need to go back and rewatch this video, I understand, because it's hard to follow the logic that I went through with this, but I hope you guys did learn something from this video. This entire exercise will actually be in our draft guide. So if you wanted to use this template that I created and reassess these guys based on your own opinion, let's say you disagree with the fact that I think Terry McLaurin can get 160 targets, you can go through in our draft guide and go through this template yourself and be like, no, Terry McLaurin isn't getting that many targets, and see what your own results spit out. And you can do that if you have access to our draft guide, which you can get right now. If you go to the fantasystockexchange.com, it's $30 for both our dynasty draft guide, which is live right now, and our redraft draft guide, which will be live in mid-July. Or if you don't want to pay $30, you can simply deposit a $10 first-time deposit on Underdog Fantasy, and you'll get both of our draft guides totally for free, and a free $25 that you can go ahead and play with and win money on, and you can enter the Best Ball Mania 2 contest with that $25. So if you made it to this point in the video, I appreciate you. You're a true OG. Please let me know. Again, I'm going to try and do quarterbacks and tight ends for this as well. They're going to probably be a little bit less in depth than running backs and wide receivers were, because we know those positions are very important in fantasy. But if you made it to this point in the video, comment down below. Wide receivers are fantasy assets too. It ain't just running backs. So if you guys enjoyed, peace out and enjoy your Monday.
Why do you need the money?